Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Tim Schwanen, and I will be the moderator of today's webinar, in which we will be discussing the launch of the Peak Synthesis report focusing on urban sustainability in Latin America. And the webinar is a direct offshoot of the Shaping Urban Futures MOOC. We are very excited to have among our audience today many of the learners on the course. And there's always the possibility for those of you who find there's an interesting topic to register for the course on Coursera, and we'll share a link in the chat with further information. Before we start with the actual conversation, I'd like to share some housekeeping rules. We're very keen to receive your questions, and please post them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I will do my best to address all of them, but we may run out of time at the end of our seminar. So we'll do as many as we can. Today's session is recorded and will be made available on the Shaping Urban Futures course in Coursera and on other platforms. The session will be for about 90 minutes. We'll have a discussion amongst the panelists for the first 60 minutes or so, after which we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. Now, I mentioned Peak or Peak Urban earlier, and Peak Urban was a research project in which researchers from 5 leading academic institutions cooperated, funded by UK Research and Innovation. Those universities or academic institutions were the University of Oxford, EAFIT University in Medellin, Colombia, Peking University in Beijing, the African Center for Cities in Cape Town, South Africa, and the Indian Institute for Human Settlement in Bangalore in India. PEAK, or PEAK, is an acronym of Predict, Emergence, Adoption, and Knowledge Exchange. The PEAK approach helps urban actors to predict aspects of city life, understand the emergence of new developments and change, adopt appropriate interventions, and facilitate knowledge exchange to support urban research and action. The approach was developed and applied in various cities, including the wonderful city of Medellin in Colombia. And the synthesis report that we're discussing today summarizes some of the key insights that emerged from the PEAK research that was undertaken in Medellin, Colombia. And again, you will find a link in the chat to that report, which has literally just come out. We will be discussing that report and issues around it with 2 PEAK researchers who have undertaken and led work in Medellin, Professor Juan Carlos Duque and Dr. Juan Pablo Orjuela. Juan Carlos, would you mind briefly introducing yourself?
Hi, Tim, and hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us in this webinar. My name is Juan Duque. I'm full professor at Universidad EAFIT. I've been here 15 years, 10 years in the economic department and 5 years in the School of Science. Well, ready to share with you exciting results from this project.
Juan Pablo, would you mind introducing yourself?
Thank you, Tim, and thank you everyone for joining. Happy to be here with all of you, with Tim, with Juan Carlos, and with everyone in the audience. I am Juan Pablo Orjuela, as Tim just mentioned. I am a senior research associate and executive education program director at the Transport Studies Unit in the School of Geography and the Environment of the University of Oxford. I've been at the University of Oxford for about 4 years. Born and raised in Colombia, but working from the UK. And my relationship with my home country, I guess, is, of course, one of the things that influenced my work in PEAK.
Thank you, JP. Before we start the actual conversation, I would like to apologize for the fact that today's panel is not exactly excelling in terms of gender and racial diversity. This is not what we would have liked, but it's partly a consequence of who was available for this seminar at a time when the Peak Urban Project has officially come to an end. We will try to make some of the voices of women in particularly Medellin audible in this webinar later on. Okay, let us begin with the discussion, and I would like to invite Juan Carlos in the first instance to tell a little bit about the peak projects that EAFIT has been leading on over the last couple of years.
Thank you, Tim. Well, our group here at the EAFIT University, we led 5 projects within the peak project. I'm gonna briefly summarize each one of them, but remember that this content or a summary of the results can be found in the report that we are launching today. So the first project is about the challenge that have to face fast-growing cities. This project was led by Jairo Gomez here from Rice Group, and the idea in that project was helping local authorities in regions like Asia, India, Africa to be better prepared for process of fast urban growth. Yeah. In that project, we developed models that predict urban growth and population distribution using open data and artificial intelligence, machine learning specifically. We also applied these models in China in collaboration with colleagues in the peak project from China, India, and the UK. And these models, because of the type of data we are using, they can be used literally anywhere in the world. In fact, currently the biggest public utility company in Colombia is using those models to predict water consumption in several cities in Colombia. So this is a brief summary of the first project, challenge faced by fast-growing cities. The second project is about challenges that face already built cities, which are the case of Latin American cities, which we don't expect them to grow fast or much bigger. And the challenge in those cities is to revisit the already built cities and try to organize things inside them to guarantee equal access to opportunities and cities for all. That's the big challenge in Latin American cities. And in that project, we cover several topics. For example, the relationship between urban form and health. Also, topics related to environmental justice, for example, access to green space, the relationship between access to green space and happiness, and the relationship between green space and good health. Also, we study the relationship between urban form and productivity. We did that specific research with the World Bank, covering all Latin American cities. Also, the relationship between land use and car accidents and crime. And finally, new models for designing bike paths, trying to increase accessibility and usability of this type of infrastructure. This is then the second project. The third project is about economic challenges faced by Colombian cities specifically. And many of those problems are also present in other Latin American cities, but we focus in Medellin in this case. We developed models in that project. We developed models that help us to map commercial informal commercial activity using artificial intelligence. Also, we study the income mobility within Colombian cities. How easy it is for a person to move up in his income level. Also, new models to design regions or association between municipalities to foster innovation, economic diversity, and economic growth. It's a very important topic. It is economic complexity theory. Another research within that project was how to improve the system of cross subsidies to fund utilities in Colombia. We have a very strange model for subsidies in Colombia, and we think we can do much better in assigning those resources. And finally, we use information from Google Street Maps and combined with artificial intelligence to assess the capacity of buildings to resist earthquakes. As you will see, there are many different topics, but all of them are within this project of economic challenges in Colombian cities. This will be the fourth project, is about informal settlements. That was led by Edward Calderon. He's now in the UK also. In this project, we try to better understand how forced displacement people settle in the territory. And we studied the way they self-build their houses and the way this process reflects many or give us information about the way they live in the places of origin, the culture and the lifestyle. And we use that information to generate recommendations that can be taken into account in different housing models for displaced people. It could be home improvement or new housing, or also using the formal city to accommodate displaced people. So we learn a lot about how can we fit them better in the city, and try to solve a little bit the tension between the necessity from them to integrate with the society, but also preserving their cultural and their identity. It's like this, trying to get that balance between those two tensions. And finally, the PIPE project is about localizing the SDGs in local communities. And in this case, we study how local actors can play a very important role in localizing the SDGs. And also, we use the way we handle the pandemic here in Colombia as a way to learn different methods to make things happen regarding the SDGs. Like we did, like I would say, very well in handling the pandemic. And many of those actions, I guess we can learn a lot from them when implementing the SDGs. So I think that would be like a short summary about the 5 projects we led here in EAFIT. We can talk about each one of them later, but this is a brief summary.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. It's a fascinating set of projects you've been leading. You must be a very lucky man and very privileged to have been able to lead those. Now, as you know, last week I was actually in Medellin, and we and saw the city, its liveliness and its dynamism. And it's fair to say that some 20-25 years ago, Medellin was a really different city, right? So there's been a lot going on, a lot of development in Medellin and also in other Latin American cities. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what has changed since 2000 or thereabout, and how that has informed the peak research that you and your team have been doing.
Thank you, Tim, for the question. That many things happened the last decade here in Colombian cities in general. I can talk more specifically about Medellin in a few minutes, but in summary, like we have made great progress regarding the decreasing the multidimensional and the monetary poverty in Colombian cities. For example, multidimensional poverty rate has decreased during the last decade from 30% to 19-20% in the last decade. That's the multidimensional poverty. And the monetary poverty rate has decreased from 37 to 27%. Those are important achievements. We can talk about the challenges that we are going to face, but I think we have done an important progress regarding poverty here in Colombia. Also, the middle class in urban cities has been growing from 17% to 30%. I'm comparing the last decade. Yeah. So 17 to 30%. Also, very important achievement, the accessibility to education has improved significantly in urban areas. Now, the coverage rate in preschool education went from 67 to 80% in the last decade. And also, we have improved the access to basic education. We have almost like 100% coverage currently, and also high school. Now we moved from 67 to 84% during the last decade. So important figures, important achievements in poverty, middle class, education, access to education. Also, we studied the shape of the cities in Colombia and in general in Latin American cities, because we know that the urban form play an important role in the economic and social development of the cities. And we found that in general, Latin American cities are still compact cities, dense cities, which are key factors to keep sustainability within the cities. And that hasn't changed much during the last decade. Now, if we focus on Medellin, I would highlight at least three important achievements in this city. First of all, this collaboration between the local state, the local authorities, the industry, and the university. They excluding maybe the current administration, but it has been more than one decade ago, and that this collaboration between these three institutions have been working pretty well when promoting important urban transformation in the city. So that would be the first. Second, this investment in social infrastructure in the poorest neighborhoods of the city. This is maybe one of the reasons why Medellin is so famous regarding the urbanism of the city. These infrastructures in the poorest neighborhood of the city, which include like cultural centers, libraries, parks, that had a great impact in social cohesion in the city. That would be my second biggest achievement in this city. And finally, another topic for which Medellin is pretty famous is the improvements in public transportation. We still have a long way to go in order to solve mobility within the city, but we have public transportation that has been facilitating mobility and access to opportunities for residents in pretty much all the areas within the city. Big achievement in transportation, but big challenges ahead. So that would be a quick summary about like what has been happening in the last decade in Colombian cities and specifically in Medellin.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. It's very clear and very very nicely summarized. I want to follow up on the last point that you were making about the changes in the improvements in the transport system. And the reason for doing that is that the work that Juan Pablo has been doing in Medellin is very much related to questions of transport. So Juan, maybe you can summarize the work that you've done and sort of the role of transport within that.
Yeah, perfect. What I've done in the Medellin metropolitan area focuses mostly on what we call accessibility to well-being, or maybe spaces of well-being in some sort. And there's a lot to unpack there, but I just want to emphasize some few points. First, that our work has been a co-produced research on accessibility of healthy living. So a research that has a component of research participants being a constitutive part of our research and informing our research in different ways. Our participants is a group of 40 women with very low incomes living in Itagüí, which is a municipality part of the Medellin metropolitan area, and they live in the corregimiento, which is the peri-urban area of that municipality. Another part, as I've said, this is accessibility to well-being spaces or to well-being in general. And what we do with this co-production approach is to begin by a definition of well-being and what are these spaces that we feel that bring well-being to our lives, in conjunction with our co-researchers. So with this group of 40 women, we begin with a conversation of what does well-being, what does the city offer in terms of well-being, what are those spaces that you want to access in well-being, to bring you well-being in your life. So it could be of course healthcare, or it could be places for recreation, parks, things like that. And that construction of what well-being means, it's a co-production, as I've been saying, with this group. And the last thing that I emphasize of what I said at the beginning of co-production research on accessibility to healthy living is the accessibility part. And that is where the transport part of all of this comes into play. How do we access these places? What role does the transport system play in allowing us and allowing them to access these spaces that we've labeled as places of well-being? So you can have a city where there's a lot of parks, but these parks are very far from you. So how do you get there, and what does the transport system help you to get there? Or you can have parks that are very close to you, but getting there, it's very difficult because of your other day-to-day activities, for example, which also plays a part. So we have a lot of conversations. So what does real accessibility mean? In terms of schedule, maybe there's a park right next to your house, but it's only open when you're not around in your house. So these kinds of obstacles we also mentioned. And the area where we work is a very interesting area because, as I just mentioned, it's like up in the mountains, a very steep part of the Medellin metropolitan area, which is quite ubiquitous in terms of finding steep hills in Medellin. Is very easy as soon as you set a foot outside. But these are also areas where the transport systems complement each other in very interesting ways. So you have, of course, the metro, the metro system that goes parallel to the river in the valley, and you have different bus solutions that the different mobility authorities have offered as a relationship to this. The area itself does not have a cable car as the ones that Medellin has been famous for. Many people in the audience probably know about these cable cars as a way of answering to this question of how do we access these very steep areas where there's narrow roads and it's not easy to move about. but of course, there comes this this question of informal or paratransit or informalized transport, in which other actors at different scales start filling the gaps that the central transport system offers. So in our territory, for example, we see a lot of communal taxis where 4, 3, or 5, between 4 and 5 people can take the same car, and will take them down to the city center, and they share a route and a schedule and everything. It's quite set, but they share this car. So we study some of the relationships of how all of these transport alternatives that are available in Medellin and in the Medellin metropolitan area, how do they interact with each other to offer different levels of accessibility to these spaces that we have defined.
Excellent, thank you. I think both of you are suggesting that there's been many positive changes in Medellin in particular, but there are also quite a few challenges. There's still a long way to go with some of the words that you used, Juan Carlos. And I was wondering if you both could talk a little bit more about this, and particularly when we think about the Sustainable Development Goals, which have been set with 2030 as a target date. Realizing many of them in Medellin and in many other Latin American cities may not be as easy as it looks. Juan Carlos, please.
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, like big progress, but a long way to go, and we have to speed things up if we want to make it to the 2030. The main issues. First of all, we need to work harder in reducing inequality if we want to meet the SDG goal. Yeah, the Gini for the per capita income in Colombia pretty much got stuck in 0.5. During the last decade, it went from 0.53 to 0.5. So that's almost nothing. So it gets stuck there, and we need to work better and harder on that, because it's still high. But the even more alarming is that when you combine inequality with segregation, and segregation is still a great problem in Colombian cities. All Colombian cities are like at least 2 cities in one. Yeah, the only change is whether it's north-south or east-west, but the segregation is a great problem. When you segregate people, you have poverty traps. You lose positive spillovers effects that help people to improve and help improving social mobility. Many negative impacts of this dangerous combination of inequality and segregation. Very important to work on that. When we try to decompose inequality, trying to find which dimension is the one that make the greatest impact on inequality, as a way to help local authorities to focus a little bit on the problem, we found that inequality in housing condition is the dimension that contribute the most to that multidimensional poverty. Housing is important. I told you earlier that we have done very well in access to education, access to opportunities, but housing, according to our estimations, is the one that is leading the problem. Another problem related to the SDGs is that our cities are not ready to face the climate change challenges. We think that because we are in Colombia, tropical area, nice weather, And you know that now you can see more often that we have floodings, flash floodings in cities that no, is incredible that we have those problems in those cities. But I think we have to look at that issue more carefully, because we are already being affected by that. And well, honestly, I don't see much action on that regard. Also, I told you, at least in Medellin, big progress on transport, public transport, for example, the possibility for deprived areas to use that transport to get to improve the access to opportunities. But we still have a big problem in Colombia regarding mobility. Public transport needs to be improved, not only in Medellin, but in many other cities, Bogota, Cali, etc. We need to work harder on more innovative ways to reduce congestion in the streets, improve coverage, and also if you improve those two dimensions, of course, the impact on quality of life will be amazing. So new ways to think about how to reduce congestion, I would highlight that as the challenge regarding the mobility in Colombia. Social mobility, I talked earlier about that. Social mobility is important in Colombia. This segregation is creating poverty traps that make it even harder for Colombian people to move up in the socioeconomic status. And we found in a study led by Eduardo Lora and Niamh O'Clery from the UK team, that mobility in women is lower than social mobility in men. So that's important. And again, in all these aspects, we need to work harder. We also found that although formal employment is increasing, but not fast enough to meet the SDGs. So another important challenge, speed up this transformation from informal employment to formal employment. And finally, I would say that although Colombian cities, or in general Latin American cities, are not growing fast, we found in one of our studies that the growth that we have had in Latin American cities, 80% of the land that has been used for that growth is protected areas, which is a very important finding. So thanks God we are not growing fast, because we have already big cities, because the marginal growth we are having is right on top of protected areas. And this is something that needs to be taken seriously if we want to meet the SDGs. So that would be like my list of top challenges in Colombian cities to meet the SDGs team.
Thank you. We'll come back to some of these in the next part of the discussion, but I wanted to pick up on something you mentioned, which is around gender and gender inequalities in social mobility. And I'm wondering whether Juan Pablo has anything to add here, given that his work was focused specifically on working with low-income women in the periphery of the Medellin urban area.
Yes, thanks. Thank you, Tim. I'll begin by echoing what you said at the beginning of how we are acutely aware of its three men voices audible here, but I'll try to do my best to kind of share some of the main issues that have come up from our group. So let me emphasize that I'm just the spokesperson here with the power that's associated to. And I'll also address one of the questions that is already in the chat in terms of how the accessibility, how does gender play into this accessibility question? And I think that this is a very interesting aspect. And it actually relates also to the other question in the chat, which talks about last mile. So I will try to sum all of this up in one single answer, but I'm happy to go deeper into any of them if it's needed. But the first thing is to consider what the first question talks about, the last mile connectivity. And I tend to not talk about last mile connectivity because the expression last mile has embedded this assumption that your trip is of multiple miles and you're just trying to solve the last one, right? But one of the things before, and which is extremely important, and I think that Medellin has done a very important job there in terms of having a real multimodal focus. This connection between the cable car and the metro has been essential from the beginning by design. Medellin has public cycling systems that are also by design introduced into the system. Many metro stations have connectivity to cycles and to other methods. The way that the metro is connected to the BRT, to the bus rapid transport system, is always thinking about how to create this interconnectivity. And I think that this is essential for that last mile. So of course that's important, and Medellin has done some really interesting efforts in that sense. But there are also many other trips associated to our daily lives, which are not necessarily last mile. And they're still short. Think about when you go grocery shopping, or if you need to do some errands close to your house or place of work, or maybe family and friends live close by and you go and visit them, care for them, or care for their kids, for example. So without having to dwell too much on this idea of the mobility of care, I won't go into the details, but I just want to mention some of the people in the audience may be related to this concept, that the idea is thinking about all of these trips that we do to care for our household and for others. So again, grocery shopping, chaperoning people when they have to go to the hospital. So in our research, these ideas of mobility of care came up really quickly. And in our case, it was specifically during COVID, when the whole concept of care was so out in the air. Let's say we were all talking about how do we care for each other. And suddenly there's this tension between traveling exposes me to COVID and exposes others to COVID. Is how do I care for my household without ignoring the care duties that I have to other people in the community? And I think that there's a lot of work to be done. I think that one of the things that if we do want to move forward in terms of cities that are more equitable, that have a gender focus on the way that we design our transport systems, we'll have to have a more nuanced idea on why is it that we're traveling, and try to move away from these ideas of we travel to work and back, but we travel for different purposes. And that's when these distinctions, these differences between genders start popping up because of mostly, I would say, patriarchal inheritance. We have communities where most of the work done of the care work is done by women, and yet we keep designing transport systems to move from very long distances as if it was like someone who has a home, goes to work and goes back. So in our research, we try to bring that out. And one of the things that is highlighted in the document, in the country report that we have from PEAK, is how one of the ways to break these traditional systems is by using these co-production techniques, informing policy. So you will find in the document, for example, that there is a section in which we talk about the work that we did with the development plan in Itagüí. Just for context, people in mayors and presidents in Colombia have development plans that last for 4 years and at the end of their 4 years, they are held accountable into, they promised that they were doing this much. Did they actually promise or not? And did they actually fulfill their promises or not? And if they don't fulfill their promises, this has some severe consequences. Sometimes even they can be removed from office. So it's a serious program, let's say, a serious plan. And through our group, one of the things that we managed to do was some of these voices that have been traditionally been ignored or haven't been given a voice that is loud enough. We managed to have this group of 40 women to directly inform the development plan, to comment on the development plan, and to suggest changes to the development plan. And some of these changes, we suggested many of them, but some of these changes were actually incorporated into the development plan that is then turned into an executive order, which included, for example, one of the things that they highlighted was our territory is a territory where we walk many of these trips, and the mayor has proposed a wider network of pedestrian walkways, but we want some of them to be pledged for our territory specifically. So there was a shift on the way that the investment was going to be prioritized to listen to these voices and offer the kind of transport alternatives that they have. And of course, there were some other aspects associated to local leaders and things like that that I won't get into the details. But I think that to summarize all of this, I think that recognizing that trips can be shorter than a mile, that's why I kind of move away from the expression of last mile, recognizing that voices have been traditionally ignored and giving space for these voices to be heard, and working together between researchers and policymakers will definitely create a difference in the kind of transport systems that we're designing nowadays.
Thank you, Juan Pablo. I think you're making some really important points there about transport, which is almost music to my ears, as given my own role and my own expertise. But I cannot stress enough how important the point is that Juan Pablo is making about thinking about the whole range of trips that people take, and not only about the commute, and not only trying to provide for the commute. And this is also why this is particularly important in a context where congestion is a big issue, which was something that Juan Carlos mentioned, and which I think certainly in Medellin is a real issue. But often you see that the pressure then is, and the discourse becomes focused on the economic damage that congestion is doing, and that particularly workers and companies and firms are suffering from this. That is very much true, but commutes are only, in most cities, they're about 20% at most of the trips that people take. So it is really important to think about these other trips as well, and particularly short trips on foot, because walking, despite there now being more emphasis on walking and more attention being paid to walking, still remains a seriously under provided for form of mobility in urban policy across the whole planet, not only in Latin America, very much also in Europe. The other point I think that's really important is about participation and about collective empowerment, because one of the things that Juan Pablo's work has done, and has done really, really well, is that he worked with this group of women, about 40 women, who individually felt strongly disempowered, who really felt that their voices were never going to be listened to, and that it was not worth speaking up and engaging with participatory processes. And the strength of the work that Juan Pablo has done is bringing these women together, making them realize that they do have a voice that is worth listening to, that they're facing very similar problems and issues, and that if they have the confidence to engage with these processes, they can make a material difference. And for me, that is one of the most significant contributions that that the work that Juan Pablo has undertaken as part of PEAK, and is really an important set of lessons for other cities, not only in Latin America, but also beyond. So thanks for sharing that. Juan Carlos, I realize you had your hand up a while ago when I started speaking. I'm sure you have something to add to what I just said.
Yeah, well, I have to recognize that it's not my area of expertise, but like something that we try to promote in PEAK and try to understand when we want to generate new solutions for city problems, is that cities are complex systems, and that the solution of a problem in one system may be in other systems. So when I listen Juan Pablo talking about these challenges in accessibility for women, etc. Well, when we tackle that problem from the PEAK perspective, we find that, for example, the accessibility problem is not always matter of like building more infrastructure and more transport, public transport, etc. But for example, like a big factor that explains accessibility, job accessibility for women in deprived neighborhoods is related to childcare, for example. Yeah. So you may solve a accessibility problem by providing more places for childcare close to their homes, so that they can take the kid to the childcare facility, and you may be solving an accessibility problem from another perspective. Yeah, another way, like land use, how to bring job opportunities closer to the places they live. No, it doesn't require more infrastructure, just a rearrangement in land use. And this is just a couple of examples of how the PEAK approach allow us to think a little bit out of the box and promote or propose solutions that are in other systems in order to solve problems in other systems. But it has been very interesting approach to work with, and that's why I think the course in Coursera will have a big impact, because in the MOOC, the people will be able to take a closer look to this methodology, so that they can apply it in their city problems.
Thank you, and I couldn't agree more. This idea of cities as systems of systems is really important, and thinking about cities as the sites where different cities encounter one another and intersect and complement and sometimes also complicate each other's functioning. That is really important. Juan Pablo, please come in.
Thank you. Yeah, just very briefly, but some thoughts that were triggered by what you two were just talking about, and also one of the questions in the chat. I wanted to mention one of the examples of that we've seen with our accessibility measures, of how these trade-offs start happening, with what Juan Carlos was just mentioning in terms of where is childcare facilities offered. So with the mathematical models of space-time accessibility that we are creating, this is a tool that allows us to combine different elements into how accessibility ends up playing out, and it's a really nice tool, because it combines three systems that are typically seen separately, which is like the transport system, the environmental part of the system, and the land use part of the system. So land use and transport, of course, have traditionally been seen as together in many ways, but what our tools offer is this option to evaluate how these systems interact to give a specific accessibility measure. So one of the examples that we have used to illustrate what our tools do is we have the group of co-researchers that we work with, and there's a specific childcare facility that they need to access, to drop their kids at. And what we do is we start playing with the different alternatives to improve their accessibility, and we see that in the current state of affairs, the negotiation that happens for them to be able to reach the childcare facility ends up having repercussions in the rest of their life. So there's this case that we've proposed of a woman in this territory that needs to visit at least 5 clients in a day. If she doesn't meet the 5 client target, then that means that throughout the day she's not going to be able to earn enough to make ends meet at the end of the month. So this is a very strict target, but she needs to visit all of these people. She also needs to take her kids to the childcare facility. And suddenly her lunch and her meals become optional. Do I have time to have lunch between visits or do I not? And we start kind of playing around with these different variables, and we see how the decision of making sure that their kids have proper childcare, the decision of making sure that she visits enough clients to have enough money to sustain her livelihood, means that her day-to-day activity becomes unhealthy in other parts of the chain, because she's not having lunch, she's not having time to exercise, she's not having time for herself to just take care of her mental health. So what we do with our tools, and I come back now to the question of a little bit how this can translate into policy, is that with these tools we can now start thinking about, well, what happens if I affect the land use in a way that these kinds of facilities and the services and goods that I need to access are brought closer to where they live? That's one option. How much is this going to improve their accessibility? Or what happens if instead of doing that, what happens if I create more bus routes so that they can access the physical territory that they can access is expanded in different ways by having quicker and cheaper transport routes. So we can kind of put all of these options in different scenarios in our tools and inform policy on what are the actions that are affecting their accessibility in different ways. Of course, again, coming back to the report, I'll emphasize how the process that we did in terms of development of the development plan informed the development plan and informed policy in that way, by emphasizing what I just mentioned at the beginning of the pedestrian walkways, but also the environmental leaders program was reinstated because of what we informed. In terms of access to healthy food, for example, the whole development plan included something on farmers markets. The participatory processes were engaged. So all of these things right from the beginning in our research, we were informing policy on what was going on instead of creating just one single document at the end. This is what we learned, and this is what the inspired academics came up with. As we went along through the process, we were informing policymakers of what we were learning, and this was kind of intertwined in the policies that they were defining.
Thank you, Juan Pablo. Your last points about policymaking actually are very well attuned to one of the questions that we've received from audience members about how the research has translated into policy for Medellin and other cities, and you've given us some very good examples. I'm going to ask Juan Carlos whether he can talk a little bit more about policy impact of the work that he's been doing. But before that, I've got a question for both of you, which is that if we are thinking, if we're taking this idea of cities as systems of systems seriously, and need to think about lateral connections between different systems and something happening in systems A having effects in systems B, C, and D. That poses major challenges to policy making, particularly when policy making is often very much siloed, in particular institutional silos. How can we deal with this tension between what the research says and how policy is organized and institutionalized? I know this is a big question, but I was wondering if you have some thoughts on this.
Well, yeah, important question, not easy answer, but I'm gonna give you a peak-based answer. Like, I would love, and I'm gonna allow me to dream here a little bit. I would love to have, how are they called, Juan Pablo? Las secretarías de planeación, the secretaries of planning, secretary of health, secretary, all those, the heads of those offices, I would love them to be co-working in the same space. That would be awesome. Is one of them in their office, isolated, taking care of the silo, is not the way things should be doing if we want to cross-fertilize ideas around the different systems. So a first crazy idea would be having them working together in the same space, sharing the space, so that they can communicate easily and trying to trigger ideas. Also, the role of academy in this issue is very important, because we as academic persons, we can move easily through the different scenarios and try to communicate our findings and ideas from one secretary to another. It's all about how to cross-fertilize ideas, and we can be like the bees moving around, sharing ideas and moving them around. And also try to keep as much as possible, because I think it has been working very well, this connection between industry, local authorities, and academic also, this conversation, and in different spaces, because here in Medellin, we have different spaces in which these sectors can encounter and share ideas. We have to keep that as a way to avoid having these silos and these connections between those systems. And also, like, promoting the peak approach. One of the acronyms of the letters is related about how to address or how to see a problem from the lenses of multidisciplinarity. If we teach people, policymakers, to use those lenses of multidisciplinarity, I think we can make a great contribution to allow this connection between the different systems and in order to provide solutions with more impact. I'm going to leave it there.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. That also sort of makes me wonder, Juan Pablo, about the work that you've done in Medellin, where from the start you designed bringing different policymakers into the discussions around the issues you were looking at. And I was just wondering if you could tell a little bit about how you did that and what your experiences were of bringing in people from these different silos, not only at the urban level, but also from the national government.
Yes, thank you, Tim. I would start by saying that this crazy dream that Juan Carlos has of having them all working together, for me, the Medellin metropolitan area has a very specific agency that works really good, which is the metropolitan area, right? when the different cities got together and they created this metropolitan area of 10 municipalities in one single under one single authority. They created this authority, which is the Área Metropolitana del Valle de Aburrá, which is this authority that encapsulates transport, environment, and land use. And having these kinds of agencies that mix different things that have traditionally been siloed was, I think that it's one of the great things that Medellin has to offer in terms of planning a metropolitan area. So it's across different cities, there's multiple mayors, one single authority named by all of these mayors, that encapsulates different topics. That's one of the things that I really think that helped Medellin a lot in these kinds of things. And coming back to what Tim was mentioning in terms of our research, we invited different people from the metropolitan area to come to our workshop. So although in our co-production approach, there were different levels of engagement, and the group of 40 women that we mentioned, the group called DIMU, was an essential part of the whole thing. Our co-production approach, of course, went beyond this. And in workshops, you very quickly notice that these silos do exist that are but that people that are coming to the workshops are very aware of the silos. They are very aware of how they make use of these workshops as something that it's important for them in their day-to-day life as professionals, as public servants, because they get to interact with other secretaries. So we had people from mobility, people from health, people from environment, sitting in the table and giving their different their different opinions around this. And this approach of creating this space for these kinds of things is essential. And I would focus on three very brief points. The first one is the role that specific topics have in uniting these silos. So when we talk about climate change, when we talk about gender, when we talk about care, all of these topics are cross-cutting, and we need to make greater efforts to recognize how these topics are not the topics of one single agency. I remember talking to the Secretary of Gender in Itagüí, and she was saying, if all of the other secretaries were doing their job, I wouldn't need to be here, because gender is part of transport, gender is part of environment, gender is part of planning, gender is part of finances. If they were doing their job, I wouldn't have to have a specific job to deal with gender. And I get her point, and I applaud it, let's say. And I think that there's multiple things like that. When we talk about climate change, we're talking about industry, we're talking about economic development, we're talking about environment. Climate change is typically assigned to the environmental people, but they don't need to know about everything. But these cross-cutting topics, we need to find ways in which these topics are not led and executed by one single authority, but that they create this place where everyone brings something to the table. So cross-cutting topics, civil society groups, just like Juan Carlos was saying in terms of academia. I think that in terms of civil society groups, there's also, in our day-to-day experiences, we don't experience our life in silos, right? We don't think like, okay, now I am a transport person, like now I am a working entity. We have all of these. I'm working, but at the same time I'm receiving WhatsApp messages from my family. Like this mixture is something that is closer to the way that we experience life. And I think that civil society groups are particularly well attuned to having these complexities brought to the table. So engaging with civil society groups is going to be a key part. So cross-cutting topics, civil society groups, and something that maybe it's just my bias, but I was trained as an engineer, and moving into the social sciences kind of group where I am part of, and being surrounded by social scientists in the peak urban project where we had this multidisciplinary, I realized that at least in Latin America, we tend, and I think that this happens in many parts of the world, so it's probably almost universal, but at least in Latin America that I can talk to with more confidence, we have this tendency to just benefit, to benefit quantitative quantitative disciplines and quantitative data. So the way that we take decisions has to be informed by numbers and numbers and numbers all the time. And we see economists and engineers and mathematicians in charge of all of these agencies. And I think that the social sciences need more room. We need to be aware of this bias and bring in social scientists into the way that we're discussing things, because as soon as we move into the qualitative part of all of this, we get again closer to the actual lived experience, but at the same time, things become more complex. And as engineers, we're not particularly trained to deal with human complexity, but we need to embrace it instead of shy away from it. So I think that the social sciences have a really, really important role to play in how to deal with this complexity, to connect these different topics, to move us away from our comfort zone of this siloed engineer kind of square vision of the world, and try to be more flexible and creating systems that are closer to the experience, even though more complex. So this tendency of specific sciences to shy away from qualitative data has also resulted in making it very difficult to move away from this silo. So welcoming these kinds of methodologies and interactions and things like that is something that I think can go a really long way. And this is something that we tried to do in our research, and it worked pretty good, I must say.
Tim, you are muted.
Sorry, I was saying thank you for those reflections, Juan Pablo. I think you've learned a lot from Peak, and in one of the things we tried to do with Peak was to cultivate a new generation of researchers who would be able to speak across different disciplines, different ways of doing research, working with different kinds of data. And I think you've just articulated very well how important that process is. So thanks very much for that. Juan Carlos, did you want to respond to what Juan Pablo was saying?
Yeah, I just have a small anecdote about what Juan Pablo just said about multidisciplinarity. Like before we get into the big project, we claim ourselves. I'm talking about the RISE group. We claim ourselves as a like multidisciplinary group. Yeah. Now I feel a little stupid when I remember that, because we thought that okay, we are multidisciplinary group because we use many different quantitative methods. So I mean, that's not multidisciplinary. No, like, yeah, we use artificial intelligence, we use remote sensing, we use GIS. Well, now that I look back, that wasn't multidisciplinarity. When we enter the big project and we start interacting with social scientists, that was a huge challenge for us. And we learned a lot from that process, you know. So multidisciplinarity is, you know, about closing that bridge between social science and quantitative science. And I just wanted to mention that is a big challenge, and we as a group learn a lot about that process within the PIP project, and I hope the people that is going to see the course in Coursera will have a better and much clear idea about what multidisciplinary means. Yeah.
Thank you. We've got some time for more questions, so please, if you have questions for any of us, do put them in the Q&A box. We've got two questions still outstanding there. One question is on ex-novation and deinstitutionalization in relation to urban transitions in Medellin. I think we've partly covered that insofar as policy processes are involved, and the important way of trying to break down the silos that traditionally traditionally exist. I was wondering, Juan Carlos, if there are other important ways in which over the past 25 years or so, existing structures have been actively broken down, and to what extent that has advanced some of the good things that we've seen in Medellin and in other Colombian cities. And I'm thinking perhaps particularly about something you mentioned about the increase in social mobility.
Can you rephrase the question, Tim?
Yeah, I'm sort of transitions. Urban transitions are very much about putting in place new things and letting them grow and mature and expand. But just as important is to break down old structures and systems that and old ways of doing things. And I was wondering if there are other examples of things that have actively been broken down in Colombian cities that should also happen in cities elsewhere in the world. And Juan Pablo, if you've got examples, please feel free to chip in.
Yeah, it's difficult to come up with more examples about that. I would like to emphasize that related to that specific question about de-institutionalization, for example, it's like, for example, when I talk about this collaboration between the private sector and the local authorities, it's not, it doesn't have to be understood as the local government giving the responsibility to the private sector to take care of things that they should be doing. It's like more like complementary work, you know. So the private sector, the industry sector has resources that can put into the city, you know, housing projects, for example, you know. So they put infrastructure related to housing projects. They don't have to be like high-level projects. They cover all the different socioeconomic status, and then they communicate with local authorities about, okay, we put this infrastructure in place. Why don't you come here and polish things around to guarantee that we are going to have green spaces, we are going to have like commercial activity to guarantee a mixed use of land. So I want just to emphasize that it's a complementary work, coordinated work. Is not about local authorities just giving the problems to the informal sector. That's one point I just wanted to make it clear related to that question. I'm gonna keep thinking about other good examples, Tim, about like changing things around to make changes. Maybe, I don't know, Juan Pablo, do you have any good example here in Medellin or in Colombia?
Well, I don't know if I can articulate it as an example, but I think that Medellin is an example city in Colombia as a city that has created very interesting links between the private sector, the civil society groups, and the public sector. And academia has also been part of it. But I think there are several examples in which Medellin has tried to empower different voices that have not been there yet. And here in this particular, besides the things that I've mentioned already, but just to not repeat myself, one of the things that I would like to highlight is a brief kind of participation that we had with hackathons. So this idea of, and this is of course implemented, I'm not going to say that this is a Medellin idea because this has been happening all over the world, but I think that this is it's a very interesting exercise in which public sector puts out a lot of data, completely open and available for different parts of civil society, and invites people to use these data that are openly sourced and that anyone can access them, and try to say, well, let's do some kind of a competition to see who comes up with interesting, innovative solutions to known problems. A little bit of like if we were to replicate what was happening a long time ago when they were trying to solve the problem of being able to tell time in boats, right? Like this famous Royal Society competition back then. How do you tell time? Let's ask everyone and give a big prize to whomever can tell us this. And hackathons are like the modern version of this. We have this bunch of data. There's different ways to analyze this data, and how do we put this into a convincing narrative. And one of the reasons why I'm bringing this up is because in Medellin they had I took part in a hackathon that was a combination of Bogota and Medellin talking about air pollution. Some of the participants in our group took part. So these are back again, like echoing what Tim was saying earlier in terms of as individuals, many people, we don't feel that we can have an actual impact of something. But when we create a group, the sense of community empowers us to start making changes. So some of the women that are part of our group, that were part of this group, that had never worked with air pollution before, that didn't feel that their training was quote unquote good enough to talk about air pollution from a data-driven perspective. They said, well, we do have low cost air quality monitors. So what if we use this data that we have collected to try to inform the data that everyone else is collecting? So they came to this hackathon, they brought their data and they said, well, this is what we have. They created a group, they found other people, they found some systems engineering people, and they found people working in air quality, environmental engineers, and they got in groups and they said, well, let's try to think about air pollution in different perspectives. So, and the big prize at the end was given by a private company in terms of different courses and different alternatives that they had to offer. So this was just a beautiful example of something initialized by a civil society group, using data from a public from the public sector, using the monitors that we had given to these women that had never engaged with the atmospheric sciences, because with air pollution, of course, but because we all do, because we all breathe air, but they hadn't engaged with the atmospheric science, and suddenly they start engaging with all of this. The prices and the interest comes from the public sectors thinking, well, actually, we could actually use some of this in our private endeavors and our profit endeavors. So these kinds of things in which we open data, we create groups of multidisciplinarity, but in which we create groups of different levels of society, different people with different lived experiences. I think that in the case of Medellin, this worked particularly well to try to destroy somehow or redesign some of these structures. I hope that
Thank you.
answers some of the
Thank you. That's a wonderful answer and a very good example. And whilst we're talking to you, Juan Pablo, I was just wondering if you could comment on the question that we've had about school travel for children on public transport. I would like to ask you to keep it brief because I'm conscious of time and I don't want to overrun the time we've been allocated.
Yeah, I'll try to keep it brief. School children in Colombia are typically Colombia is a very Latin America in general, but Colombia in specific has a big social division between the way that we access education, and that has to be mentioned. And I won't dwell on that, but I just want to emphasize how the way that we get to schools has a big social divide behind it. One of the things that has happened in this case in Bogota, in the capital city of Colombia, is that, for example, very famous posh private schools are all at the same place in the north of the city, and people live in the center or in the northern parts of the city, and they need to get, and this creates a lot of congestion. And what this has resulted is that the city has decided to create an exclusive lane for school buses, which is, I think it's the only case that I know in which the exclusive lane is not for buses in general or for other modes of transport, but specifically for school buses during the school run, which is interesting because it reduces, of course, congestion for kids, but at the same time, it reduces congestions for very privileged kids. So public schools, in that sense, don't typically have these routes, but they are more based on geographical terms in terms of accessing these places based on proximity to their house. And in Latin America, public transport is not used by kids in general. The assumption is that they are always going to be accompanied by someone else. Maybe those are the things that I just will. I know that this doesn't answer completely the question, but it starts to kind of embed some of the social local conditions of why the school children issue is not that easy to attend.
Excellent, thank you very much. We've got one question outstanding, which is a question on what's happening after peak, and perhaps I can give a short answer to that, because yes, peak, the funding for peak, I should say, has come to an end now, and the project is being wrapped up, and the Shaping Urban Futures course is in many ways the epitome of what peak has produced, and is something we're all incredibly proud of. But that doesn't mean that the work is done or that we stop collaborating. And there are all kinds of new research proposals in preparation. The reason Juan Pablo and myself were in Colombia, in Medellin last week to visit Juan Carlos was to organize a workshop for one of our follow-up projects, which is looking much more specifically on migrants coming to Medellin and how they find their way in the city. And I know that Juan Carlos and his team are also working with data analysts at UCL who've been part of peak. And there are similarly other collaborations still ongoing. So for instance, Michael Keith, PI of peak, is currently writing a book together with colleagues from South Africa, from Cape Town, and from Bangalore. So the work continues. It all becomes a little bit more fragmented, and it is no longer funded by one source of funding. But we're not at all done, and in many ways, I think peak is an excellent start for a long-term set of very collaborative, very productive collaborations that will be continuing over the next years. So please do watch this space. We've discussed quite a bit today in this seminar. It's quite clear that cities in Colombia and Latin America have come a long way. Many positive changes can be seen, but challenges remain. We've talked about income and gender inequalities. We've talked about climate risks, talked about congestion, and so on. It's also quite clear that new data makes cities like Medellin legible in new and exciting ways, especially when this systems framing is adopted that we've been talking about. At the same time, it's also clear that in-depth qualitative research is very important, if only to highlight the lived experience of the city, and sort of also trying for us to really understand the experience of disadvantage and marginalization. All of this going forward really needs to be done, we strongly believe, in a participatory manner. I think one of the real strengths of peak is that it has shown us what the potential is of participation in research and action, and that it helps us to break down some of the barriers we've been talking about. If you think these are really interesting issues that you want to know more about, then I am sure that the Shaping Urban Futures course is exactly the kind of course for you. You can, through the course, which is where you learn on your own tempo, your own speed, you learn to develop your own methods and frames to view and interpret urban changes, and you can apply them to your local context. So whilst the examples may be from cities like Medellin, you can really adapt and use some of the insights and the tools that you're given to make your own city better understandable. We have pasted the link to the course in the comments, and we strongly encourage you to go there and look up the course, and you will see that Juan Carlos, Juan Pablo, and myself are joined by a wide range of other faculty members from across all the participating academic institutions in the course. For now, I would like to thank Juan Carlos, Juan Pablo, and our audience for their participation and their contributions to the seminar. And I wish you a very pleasant rest of the day, rest of the afternoon, possibly even late night. It's been a pleasure to be here. It's been a pleasure to have this conversation with Juan Carlos and Juan Pablo. Thank you very much, and bye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Juan Carlos, and the audience. It's been a pleasure.
Bye.